Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Canassatego's speech at Lancaster from June 26th, 1744. Now, Canassatego is actually really famous for a different speech at Lancaster from July 4th, 1744. Eventually, the camera will adjust back to lighting me properly. And interestingly enough, the July 4th, 1744 speech is not in the printed edition of the Broadview Anthology of American Literature, but it is available online through them. So I will be making a video about that. But this speech from June 26th is a very interesting speech. I'm going to try and cue that. There we go. That's a little bit better. So before I talk about the speech itself, Canassatego is an interesting cat because he was a really significant diplomat, orator, politician. He worked out treaties. His rhetoric was super important. And many people argue, especially that the speech on July 4th helped to shape the what would become the United States government decades later. Canassatego was an Onondaga man. He was not sort of born into the ruling clans to the extent that's not exactly right. Like, there's not ruling clans in Haudenosaunee culture, but there's sort of clans that have more traditional access to power and clans that have somewhat less traditional access to power. And Canassatego was not sort of born to power. He achieved power through his intellect, through his rhetoric, through his diplomatic prowess, etc. Now, I was actually raised in traditional Haudenosaunee territory. I was raised outside of Rochester, New York, which was in the territory of the Seneca, who were the furthest west of the Haudenosaunee nations. The Onondaga were more sort of central New York, so east of where I was raised. And that's where Canassatego was from. But this speech given at Lancaster was in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and I'm currently a resident of Pennsylvania. So some interesting, if entirely arbitrary and accidental connections. Now, Canassatego gave this speech on June 26th, 1744, in the context of disputes over land sales. So, short version, basically, the Haudenosaunee had various pieces of territory, usually that they had conquered from other groups, like the Susquehannock or Conestoga, sometimes Algonquin peoples, whatever it was, right? So the Haudenosaunee were pretty good at conquering stuff. And sometimes they would sell that territory through treaties to the British colonists. Sometimes they would not do that. There was one instance, for example, where I believe they put some territory sort of in the trust of, I want to say, if I remember correctly, it was the governor of New York. And then the governor of New York was like, and basically the objective was, don't sell this to the governor of Pennsylvania. Don't sell it to Pennsylvania colony. And then the governor of New York was like, well, I'm off back to England. While I'm there, I might just sell that territory to Pennsylvania. So there was all this sort of stuff that happened, right? Basically much of the history of the early colonial period, the early republic, into the 19th century, and realistically even into the 20th century, is that colonial governments, the British Crown, and then the US government would make treaties or make agreements with indigenous nations and then be like, we don't give a shit. We literally don't care that we agreed to this treaty. We're going to violate it, right? So this is a lot of the thing. Now, Canassatego is taking issue with this sort of general untrustworthiness vibe that the colonists are giving off. So basically he, in this speech, is attempting to establish that the Haudenosaunee have an established prior claim to this certain bit of territory, Kohongarantas, or I'm not 100% sure from either from the footnote or the context here whether Kohongarantas was the name of the territory or the name of the peoples that the Haudenosaunee had conquered it from. But basically what Ben Franklin, who translated a lot of these speeches from the Iroquoian language spoken by Canassatego into English, what he puts in his note is, i.e. Potomac. And again, I think there was an indigenous group called the Potomac, so I don't know whether that's sort of the Potomac region or what. And then it notes Kohongarantas was the Haudenosaunee name for the Potomac River west of the Blue Ridge Mountains. I don't think they're talking about the river as such. I don't think Canassatego is talking about the river as such. So I think it may be sort of the territory in sort of northern Pennsylvania and into what's now like West Virginia, Western Maryland, places like that are sort of west of the Blue Ridge Mountains, the other side of the Appalachian Mountains from the coastal region, right? So I think that's what's at stake here. And Canassatego's basic point is we conquered this area from the Susquehannock, from the Conestoga. We are properly the owners of it. So when you made a treaty or when you purchased this from the Conestoga or the Susquehannock, they no longer had a right to sell it to you. We have a prior claim over your claim to it. You, in this case, the governor of Maryland, the governor of Maryland colony, our claim supersedes yours. And since you did not deal with us when we are the proper owners of this land, your claim to have bought this territory is invalid. That's ultimately Canassatego's main takeaway here. But the approach that he takes is really rhetorically interesting because what the speech is really focused on is this idea of priority. Not in the sense of like most importance necessarily, although that's implicit, but priority in the sense of currency, right? Who has the earlier claim, the prior claim, and that becomes the basis for a better, more legitimate claim. And this is not just relevant to Kohongarantas, right? It's not just about this particular bit of territory. What Canassatego very cunningly establishes is the prior claim of the Haudenosaunee to North America, right? It's specifically to what's now New York State, most of what's now New York State. But the prior claim, the earlier claim that indigenous peoples have to the Americas should supersede the European colonial claims. So this is, of course, a problematic conception under European frameworks because Europeans, to greater or lesser extents, conceptualized the Americas, conceptualized Australia, New Zealand, these kinds of places as what was called terra nullius, meaning sort of empty land, right? So the idea was, yeah, I mean, when we arrived, there were clearly indigenous people living here, but are they really people? Do they really have a claim to the land? And the basic argument that European colonialists made in favor of answering those questions in the negative is, we want the land. That's really the main argument. It was very little logic, rationale, justice beyond that. It was literally, we want it, so we're going to tell ourselves that these people who are clearly human beings are not human beings. These people who are clearly occupying this land don't really occupy it, and we're going to take it. So this is what we got. Canassatego really contests this, right? So from the beginning of the speech, what he says here is, when you mentioned the affair of the land yesterday, and there's a footnote here basically saying in Haudenosaunee tradition, you would debate an issue or you would respond to an argument or a claim that someone had made the day after so that you had time to think about it, to process it, to consider, to look at things from their perspective, etc., etc. So this is the question of who owns this territory, the Kahungaruntus area. When you mentioned the affair of the land yesterday, you went back to old times and told us you have been in possession of the province of Maryland above 100 years. But what is 100 years in comparison of the length of time since our claim began, since we came out of this ground? For we must tell you that long before 100 years, our ancestors came out of this very ground, and their children have remained here ever since. You came out of the ground in a country that lies beyond the seas. There you may have a just claim, but here you must allow us to be your elder brethren, and the lands to belong to us before, before you knew anything of them. So again, this is establishing priority. We, the indigenous peoples of North America, have a prior claim to this land prior to the arrival of European colonialists, and therefore our claim should be respected in the way that your claim to a territory like England or the Netherlands, because Canassatego talks also about the relationship between the Haudenosaunee and the Dutch, because the Dutch were the first Europeans to colonize what's now New York, the founding of New Amsterdam, which became New York City region, right? And the Haudenosaunee established pretty good relations with the Dutch, according to Canassatego. And then when the English came and displaced the Dutch, when they took over New Amsterdam and turned it into New York, the Haudenosaunee had good relations with them and sort of continued to strengthen relations with the European colonialists. And Canassatego deploys an extended metaphor of tying up their ships, right? So he says, first we tied them to the bushes, but then we decided those weren't secure enough. So we tied them to, I think exactly what the order is. We start with the bushes, then tied them, I think, to the trees is the second one. And then we were concerned that the trees might blow over, so we tied them to the rocks. Then we were concerned that the rocks were not stable enough, so we tied them to the mountains, right? So it's this sort of progressive metaphor of we increased the links between the Haudenosaunee and the colonists. We became more and more supportive. We embraced you, brought you into our territory, brought you into the world that we live in, etc., etc. And ultimately, this becomes, again, this notion of priority. And because the indigenous people, because the Haudenosaunee were there, and they were the ones who were sort of saying, yeah, come on, you can come, you can live here with us. This establishes the power in the relationship as belonging to the Haudenosaunee. Now, this is really, really cool because I, as a person brought up in a Western settler colonial society, the United States, much of the way that we tend to talk about relationships between indigenous people and settler colonialists, or the U.S. government, Canadian government, Australian government, etc. By extension, but especially here in the U.S. I know this for sure. The way that we tend to talk about this is the U.S. government made treaties with indigenous people. And that framing is not accidental, because what it does is it puts the emphasis on settler colonialists as the active party, the party doing something, as opposed to indigenous people to whom things are done. And this fits with a long history, and this is well documented by indigenous scholars and settler colonial scholars, etc., who look at the rhetoric and cultural perceptions of indigenous people in the United States and Canada. The traditional perception, going back to the idea of terra nullius, right, of sort of indigenous people just existing on the land rather than actually having a legitimate claim to it, that they are not productive, whatever it is, right? These are the early colonialist arguments. It figures indigenous people as passive, as people to whom things are done, rather than as people doing things. And what Canassatego foregrounds here is we took an active role. We embraced you as newcomers. We were open. We were sort of accessible in the way that we engaged with you, etc., etc. So that's really, really interesting, because again, it reverses the logic that within settler colonialism, we tend to talk about settler-indigenous relations. The other thing that Canassatego addresses here that I think is really, really important, and this is still an argument that is made by apologists for colonialism, whether settler colonialism or more sort of traditional colonialism in places like British Africa, French Africa, British India, Southeast Asia, whatever it is this sort of idea that, like, oh, Europeans brought a whole bunch of benefits to these backwards people, right? This sort of notion, like, people's lives got materially better when Europeans showed up with their technology and refined metals and whatnot. Obviously, places like India, Africa, had refined metals prior to European colonialism, but you know what I mean, right? In North America, they did not, right? They primarily used stone tools and some basic metals, but primarily stone and wooden tools. And Canassatego sort of anticipates this argument, right? This sort of idea that, like, we are now materially better off. We have better stuff now, and so colonialism is justified. Because what he says here is that we lived before they came amongst us, they being obviously colonialists here, that we lived before they came amongst us, and as well or better, if we may believe what our forefathers have told us. We had then room enough and plenty of deer, which was easily caught. And though we had not knives, hatchets, or guns, such as we have now, yet we had knives of stone and hatchets of stone and bows and arrows, and those served our uses as well then as the English ones do now. We are now straitened, and sometimes in want of deer, and liable to many other inconveniencies, since the English came among us, and particularly from that pen and ink work that is going on at the table. And he points to the secretary, right? So what Canassatego points out here is, yes, we now have metal knives, hatchets, we have guns, but the stuff we had before worked just as well for us. It served our needs. And this is a really important conception, because one of the things that's sort of fundamental to thinking about technology is that technology exists to serve a purpose. And if there is not a need for a more advanced technology, then technology will not advance because it doesn't need to. Technology only has to advance when it no longer fulfills a particular purpose. And what Canassatego points out here is that stone knives, stone hatchets, bows and arrows fulfilled our needs. We did not require the things that Europeans would bring. We used them, but we did not require them. Our needs were perfectly met by what we had. And in fact, the new system has created significant problems for us. There is substantially less game, which makes our lives harder. We are now subject to treaties and to written legal documents that we may or may not understand, because literacy rates are, of course, across the board quite low in 1744, and because Indigenous people are not primarily English language speakers. While many Indigenous people did learn English or parts of English, they were primarily speakers of their own languages. Canassatego would have been a speaker of an Iroquoian language. I don't know specifically which one, because I don't know that much about the linguistics of the Haudenosaunee. But so like this becomes a big problem, right? If I am making a verbal agreement that is then being written down, and the written document is going to have priority in a literate European legal system, if I cannot read that document to know what it says, and that it says what we agreed to verbally, then I am at a significant disadvantage. So what Canassatego points out here is what many Indigenous people and many critics of colonialism have pointed out, which is that the disadvantages inherent in colonialism often substantially outweigh the material advantages, which are, of course, also given unequally to colonized peoples.